Summer is officially here, the sun is out, it is shining, and sorry to be a downer, but so are its cancer-causing rays. Everybody knows protecting their skin from the sun is important, and most of us have heard our whole lives that sunscreen is the best defense for that. But a new study backed by the Food and Drug Administration has shown that some chemicals in some sunscreens can actually penetrate the skin and wind up in your bloodstream. So what does that mean for you and protecting your skin this summer? To find out, we're talking with Kanade Shinkai. She's a dermatologist at UC San Francisco and editor-in-chief of JAMA Dermatology. So I think this study raises a lot of questions for people on whether they should continue to wear sunscreen. So just top-line question, is wearing sunscreen still a good idea?
Wearing sunscreen is still a good idea. And sunscreen, though, is just one part of protecting your skin from the sun, and that includes seeking shade, trying not to do physical activities or activities outdoors during the peak hours of the sun, which are between 10 and 2 p.m., and then using other protective mechanisms like using hats, sunglasses, protective clothing. So sunscreen is just one part of protecting your skin from the sun.
Can you tell us a little bit about what the study looked at and what it found?
Yeah, so the study is a small pilot study that looked at the application of 4 different commercially available formulations of sunscreen. These are things that are available at most drugstores. They measured the absorption of the key sunscreen ingredients in the blood over time and also after the application had stopped. And what it found was that there is notable absorption of these sunscreen ingredients into your bloodstream, and that they reach levels really just after a few hours of applying the sunscreen and will stay elevated for almost a day or two after you stop using the sunscreen. So this means that when we put sunscreen on our skin, it's getting absorbed through the skin and it's going into our bloodstream, and it hangs around for a lot longer than the application. And the levels that were found in the study were greater than the levels that the Food and Drug Administration here in the United States uses kind of as a threshold to do safety testing. But the safety testing has not been done. So really what it's telling us is that sunscreen gets absorbed into the bloodstream, it reaches levels that are higher than this regulatory threshold, and the safety testing has not been done yet.
I think when a lot of people first read about the study, they read, oh, there's chemicals in sunscreen, it's getting into my bloodstream. Chemical has become kind of an unhelpfully broad and kind of scary term for a lot of people. They'll hear it and think, oh, chemical is bad and unsafe and dangerous. But the fact is, all physical matter is chemicals, right? So it helps to talk with specifics here. So what kinds of chemicals did this study find in people's bloodstreams?
Yeah, well, there's 2 different types of sunscreen. One type we call mineral sunscreen, and these are literally minerals, zinc oxide and titanium dioxide. They coat the skin. Technically, you could call it sunblock. They also often leave a very white color on the skin, so a lot of people don't like to use it for that reason. Those have been tested and don't have any systemic absorption, so we know that those are safe. The other type of sunscreen is what we colloquially call chemical sunscreens, and these are literally chemical filters that absorb ultraviolet light. And these are the ones that are in question. These are the ones that have never been tested in terms of their safety or their systemic absorption, 4 of which were the ones that were studied in this particular research article.
What ingredients in sunscreens specifically was this study looking at?
This particular study looked at 4 sunscreen ingredients: avobenzone, oxybenzone, octocrylene, and a camsol.
What do these chemicals actually do inside the body? Is that something we know?
Yeah, so we don't really know. There's never been any research article that has suggested that these chemicals are doing anything harmful to the human body. There are some studies, however, that have been done in laboratory animals, and of course take it with a grain of salt, because these studies always use doses that are a lot higher than what a person would be exposed to. But there have been some data points that have suggested changes to your hormone levels, changes in reproduction, and those have at least raised the question of whether or not safety testing should happen in humans. But that safety testing has not happened yet.
Even if we take the animal studies with a grain of salt, I think that not knowing is still an unsettling prospect for people. Mm-hmm. So the question I would imagine a lot of people are asking is, should I still wear sunscreen? Sort of, is it safer to be exposed to the sun unprotected, or to use this product on my body that has effects I may not fully understand?
Yeah, well, there's something absolutely certain, which is that the sun and sun exposure, and especially prolonged sun exposure, can result in sunburn, which is unhealthy, and also can lead to skin cancer. That is not in question in this study. I think what's in question is really about how effective sunscreen is in protecting long-term from skin cancer and melanoma, as well as whether it's safe. A lot of consumers don't know that sunscreen is actually considered a medication. And so because of that, usually all over-the-counter medications are subjected to battery of testing, but that has never been done for these chemical sunscreens, and that's why this study is so important.
Why hasn't that been done for sunscreen?
You know, sunscreens have been around for a long time, and they really preceded kind of the standard way that we evaluate over-the-counter medications in this country. And so, you know, usually in history and time, we find out that a medication has some side effect that might be dangerous to people, and it gets taken off the market. Now, what we try to do is do those safety studies in advance of the medication coming out. However, that hasn't been done for sunscreen because, in large part, these sunscreens predated that type of drug regulation. Over time, and in fact, as early as 1999, the Food and Drug Administration asked sunscreen companies to do these regulatory studies, but for various reasons, they have not been able to see that data.
What are alternatives to sunscreen or sort of ways of supplementing the sun-blocking effects of sunscreen?
Right now, there are sunscreens that we know are safe, and these are the mineral sunscreens that we talked about earlier, and those are not in question at all, and those have been tested.
If people are choosing between chemical sunscreen and mineral-based sunscreen, is there a cost difference?
There's no cost difference.
Are they as effective as one another?
Well, as far as we know, they're as effective. One of the things that we as dermatologists are still trying to determine is what is the effective dosage of sunscreen. I think common sense would say you want to put it on, and we all know it all rubs off when we go swimming or when we towel off or when we sweat. It still needs to be determined whether or not there's a particular dose of mineral or chemical sunscreen that is ideal for the prevention of skin cancer and melanoma. I think one important piece of this study, the research article that we're talking about, is that this was idealized conditions. So
right.
The subjects put the sunscreen on and they sat in climate-controlled environment. So they weren't swimming, they weren't sweating or even moving around, and they weren't actually exposed to the sun. And so we don't know what, in the real world, and under real-world conditions, what those systemic absorptions are like, whether they're the same or not to those found in this particular study.
Speaking of real-world conditions and the question of dosage, there's also this factor of sort of behavioral psychology, right? Which is, I know there have been some studies that look at people who apply sunscreen and think that they're getting the protection in some cases get burned worse than people who are taking protective measures to protect themselves, knowing that they haven't applied sunscreen. So that's the real-world scenario is a really big variable that is hard to account for.
It is, and this has actually been shown in studies. People put on about half the amount of sunscreen as on the sunscreen label. So that's one important real-world condition as well. But we don't actually know whether those real-world conditions, for example, if you just use less sunscreen to get less absorption, whether that would impact its safety and effectiveness as a tool to prevent skin cancer and melanoma.
What are the next steps for the Food and Drug Administration?
So in February of this year, there was a proposal put forth that the Food and Drug Administration will really mandate that sunscreen companies provide this safety testing. So the onus is really on the sunscreen companies, not on the Food and Drug Administration.
What are the next steps for sunscreen manufacturers?
Yeah, so the sunscreen manufacturers are now going to be required to test their products for safety testing. So that safety testing will begin with systemic absorption, so looking to see if it gets absorbed into the sunscreen, and that's for 12 ingredients in this particular F.D.A. ruling. And then if there is evidence of systemic absorption past or above the safety threshold that the Food and Drug Administration has for all, it's common to all medications, then that will trigger additional safety testing, which includes toxicity studies, cancer risk, and effects on things like hormones and reproduction.
How soon could this realistically affect what people see on the shelves at their local pharmacy or supermarket?
Well, in theory, if the sunscreen companies don't provide this data by November of 2019, in theory, these products could be pulled from the market. I think we would all agree this would be a very extreme measure, given that we don't actually have any data right now that they're unsafe. However, this is sort of what is being set up by this current proposed ruling. That being said, I think companies also need time to do the studies, and likely there will be an opportunity for them to request extensions as long as they're working on doing the testing that's been requested.
What is sort of the one big takeaway people should have from this study?
It's really important for people to know that it's really essential for them to protect their skin from the sun, and there's lots of different ways to do that. And sunscreen is an important piece of that. So people should still wear sunscreen. If they have concerns about the chemicals that were in this particular study, they can choose things that we know are safe, including the mineral sunscreens that we talked about earlier. But the real key here is that we don't know, especially from this study, that the 4 sunscreen ingredients that were studied are actually dangerous. We don't know that yet.
And we do know that sun exposure is dangerous.
We absolutely know that. That is not in question.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for joining us today. It sounds like sunscreen is still a good idea. If you don't want to use sunscreens that have these sort of chemicals in them, the effects of which are kind of unclear, you have other options. And people can, of course, stay out of the sun and wear protective clothing too.
Absolutely.